unique story, When the Human and the Holy Collide. Chapter 3.
Once I returned to the camp and found Hannah, I couldn't bear the sense of excitement that so many around us seemed to have. I grabbed my daughter and secluded us to the quiet of our tent. There, with my sweet little girl in my arms, I sat thinking about all the ignorant decisions I had made. How I had jeopardized everything in pursuit of this man that I thought would lead and protect us. I guess Mary knew I wasn't in the talking mood because she only smiled softly at me as she leaned in to check on us. As the day moved on, my eyes stung from the tears. I knew I had responsibilities to attend to and needed to get back on my feet. I also knew I had little hope for the coming days, but was determined to put on a brave face for Hannah. She had already lost so much. I couldn't bear causing her any more heartbreak. Hannah had fallen fast asleep, and as I slowly scooted out from under her, one of the other ladies quietly assured me they would keep an eye on her as I needed to go help prepare our meal. A few steps outside of the tent, a soft voice called my name. Mary had seen me rise, and I knew what was coming. We volunteered to prepare the vegetables that Andrew had found at the market yesterday. Standing there washing and chopping, Mary started telling me a story. Before she was a follower of Jesus, she had been orphaned at such a young age that she never had prospects for a good husband. A child left to the streets of Magdala. She took to begging and thieving just to keep food in her stomach. As she grew, the men in her village began to see her as something more than a street rat. When a young girl should be celebrating the sanctity of coming into womanhood, she was forced into a brothel at the pleasure of the men that frequented those dark places. She said she didn't have much memory of her years there. The demons that had begun to occupy her mind kept her numb to all that was being done to her body. I still find it hard to think of my friend as a vessel for the minions of hell itself. I still get chills to think about it. But no human is capable of holding the filth of seven demons. As her mind began to break, she became a nuisance to the town that she had called home. Local authorities called in healers and begged the local Jewish elders to cast out the demons and to rid the town of her insanity. Try as they might, not one was successful. She spent years being treated as a plaything in the brothel and kicked to the dust on the streets of her town. People saw her as less than human, a filthy scar on their otherwise peaceful, average existence. There were no friendly faces, no helping hands. But then one day, amidst the fits that the demons inflicted on her body, something happened. There in the arid streets of Magdala, muscles barely able to control her fragile frame, her mind began to clear just enough to be cognizant of the absolute wrath of the demons inside of her. Something had agitated them beyond their usual angst. She could hear them laughing in fear, talking to someone they knew had power over them. In the fog of her memory, she heard a pleasant voice speak. At the sound of the voice, the demons cried out as if for the first time feeling the very same torment that they had been inflicting on her. The more her frame shook, the more her mind cleared, and the more her eyes were able to take in her surroundings. Utterly racked of strength, she looked at the dusty feet of a man that had been addressing those demons by name. Before she could lift her head, a hand reached down to assist her. As he helped her up to her feet, she noticed the other men around him before she was able to even take in his face. Seeing this group, she knew this was not the usual contingent of Jewish elders that had tried so many times to free her. As her eyes beheld his face, she said she knew immediately that she had looked upon her Savior. A face so kind, but with all the authority of a king. He had done what no one else could do. Her entire life spent in sorrow, pain, beaten, abused, spat upon. And there she stood, hand in hand with God himself, As he began to ask her about what happened and to inquire about what resources she had to keep her safe, she could hear other voices in the square. She knew that what had just happened had drawn the attention of the people in the streets, including the Jewish elders. They were incensed. She could hear them ranting about this being a trick, about how she was in league with this man to put on a show. She said he didn't even seem to hear them. His attention was on her alone. When she explained that her life had been spent in the brothel and that she had nothing to her name but the ragged clothes on her back, he called her by her name and said she had a home with him. And for the first time in her life, a man did not want anything from her, but instead wanted to serve her at great risk to himself. He could have walked by her, ignored her like all the others did. And in doing so, he never would have incurred the wrath of the local authorities, but he did the risky thing, the shocking thing, and reached down to her at her lowest point to draw her up. She had been following him from that moment on. She had witnessed the kindness and compassion that he had for the people he traveled to serve. The miracles he had performed just to see people healthy and fed. But then she asked me a question. Would she have been rescued from her torment if Jesus wasn't willing to shake up the status quo? He was not considered an elder in the Jewish faith. By their laws, he had no right to even attempt to save her. She was unclean and considered untouchable. Yet he took the risk of reaching out his hand to help her. She then began to recall the miraculous things that he had done since Hannah and I had joined his followers. The things that I had witnessed firsthand, even recalling the day that Jesus had embraced my Hannah and all those other children. Through her words, I could see what she saw in those moments, whether in the quiet and subtle ways, or at the top of his voice in the riotous crowd. Jesus couldn't be safe. Safe was what we already had, a system where women like myself and Mary are less than. A belief that only young girls from reputable and living fathers are worth good marriages. A rule of law that kept those burdened with illnesses or maladies away from the God that they worshipped. Safe was what protected the rule followers, and Jesus was here to break a lot of rules. I could understand what she was trying to convey. For someone like myself, staying safe meant staying in a constant state of fear of the next punch to the gut. I was on a precipice where no choice was really safe anymore. I could go back to my hometown, penniless, and see myself and possibly Hannah begging in the streets or slaving away just to make ends meet. Or I could keep following Jesus and understand that to change the world, you have to change expectations. As we finished up our work and laid out the items for our fellow campers to enjoy, I found myself in an unexpected place. If I no longer had the choice to be safe, then how do I go forward in following Jesus? How much am I willing to lay at his feet and accept upon me, and by association, Hannah? I realized I wasn't mad anymore. He had never lied to me or promised me something that I couldn't get from being one of his followers. I had assumed that upon him myself. But was I really ready for what was to come? The table was already abuzz about what had happened at the temple. Plans were being made to uproot our camp to Mount Olivet in order to not be hassled by the local authorities. But Jesus would soon be going back to the temple. And so many within earshot were talking about following him to hear his teaching. I caught my breath. Here is the moment I had to decide. Did I want safe? Or did I want him?
I dared to hope that I could go about my day as usual. There was a sense of calm in putting my mind on a task and seeing it completed. And I needed that calm. I needed Mother bustling around going over wedding details. I needed Father knocking the dust from his cloak and sandals with plans to return to the temple stairs. I needed Jacob to at least go back to his normal mischief, if not back to his responsibilities. For Mother and Father's part, they mostly just returned to their usual routine. Admittedly, I observed they were much more subdued. As the day drew on, Jacob seemed as if he had been struck by lightning. He appeared quite agitated and constantly moving and shifting as he sat there mending the straps on the bridle. His restlessness caught Mother's eye, and she quietly patted him on the shoulder to try and calm him. I knew that she would always see him as her little boy, and not the man he was quickly becoming. Father sat at his desk and face down in his studies. He spoke no words and did not look at Jacob despite his presence being more than obvious. So, that day would be a silent one. I guess that was better than the yelling and the crying. Rising from his seat, chair scraping across the floor, Father wiped his palms down the front of his tunic to straighten the wrinkles. He turned to grab a satchel and left for the temple without saying a word. I sure hoped that he could have a successful day of camaraderie and discussion among his peers, because our house can't take detention for long. I looked across the room at Jacob. As we made eye contact, he abruptly told me that he had business near the market square and would be gone for a few hours, and I made sure to remind him of what was left to do here at home and what projects I would need his help on. Stuffing the bridle and his tools in a basket, he gave me a mumbled, "Uh-huh," and abruptly yanked on his sandals. Kissing Mother on the cheek, he grabbed his cloak from a hook and rushed out the door. The look in my mother's eyes as he left told me all I needed to know. She knew her boy well enough that it was obvious to her this was not over. And she was scared. And all I could offer in that moment was a reassuring arm wrapped around her shoulder as I, too, left to continue my day.
I got what I wanted. Well, mostly. When later I stepped out of my office, Marcus was bustling around the house, diligently checking details and pointing out work that needed to be done. As I ascended the stairs, he approached me to assure me that the old man and his wife were properly working at my stand, as contracted, and that the market was alive with trade and commerce as usual. Before a smile could break my countenance, Marcus's tone changed. Ushering me into a secluded corner, he began to lay out for me the details of his time in search of our errant household workers. He had spent endless hours searching for them. Begrudgingly, he even went into the Jewish corners of the city once he'd combed through all the areas that most Romans stick to. The men were nowhere to be found, but like what I'd heard from the people in the crowd, Marcus had heard that multiple Romans had left behind their duties in proper Roman households to run off and follow that Jew. After failing to recover the men, I was left to deduce that they had done this very thing. I told Marcus to resume his duties as usual and to look for replacements for the men we lost. I wasn't going to spend any more of my time or resources looking for those men. If they want to run off after some fantasy, fine. In light of these events, I knew I needed to check in on the local captain of the Roman Guard to get the latest news. Their posting was located in the Jewish market, so I could also get a feel for the amount of angst still present among them. Walking the streets, I felt no more foreboding about the events of the last few days impacting those days to come. The city seemed to have recovered from the upheaval. The market outside my home was mostly back to its normal state of chaos. Children were playing in the street, and men and women hurriedly moved about their daily tasks. The sun was shining, and the heat wasn't yet unbearable. I took a deep breath, thankful for the sense of normalcy. As I approached the area where our men were stationed, the streets became more and more crowded. Since it was on the border of the Jewish district, I wasn't too surprised to see that most in the crowd were Jews. Maybe it was one of their seemingly endless amounts of holy days. One of the guards was standing at post outside their small building. I approached him as I saw his eyes were drawn by the passing crowd. Before I could ask, he looked at me and explained that he was concerned about this crowd because rumors were going around that the prophet Jesus was back at the temple stairs. He thought they were flocking there to stir up trouble again. I was rather shocked to hear that the Jewish leaders were allowing this man to continue to teach from their temple. Why didn't they just kick him out? And since when did they call him prophet? This was bordering on the ridiculous, and I just about had my fill of the tolerance of this ongoing spectacle. Leaving the guard to his work, I decided it was time to approach the Jewish elders. They needed to get a handle on this. I wanted my city back to its usual state, and as long as this prophet of theirs continued to make a stir, I wouldn't be able to focus on my work. For every Jew standing there in the crowd, I was losing one more sale at my market stores. I fell in with the crowd as they approached the temple. Here I was again, tied up in the confusion and chaos, heading toward a Jewish house of worship amidst a crowd of Jewish people to investigate the same Jewish troublemaker. If you told me this would be how my week turned out a few days ago, I would have called you crazy. I couldn't help but begin to wonder if I was crazy at this point, but I just couldn't let it go. I had too much to hold on to ignore how my city had changed in just a few short days. Sure enough, there he was, commanding the attention of what had to be at least 500 men, women, children, a group of sick and lame off in a corner, young people with their elderly parents wrapped around their arm, and there among the crowd, my eyes happened to fall on my missing men. Marcus was right. They had run off to follow the Jew. The crowd was mostly silent, besides a few children's giggles or parents' hushes. I could hear him speaking. He sure wasn't like the other Jewish speakers I'd heard teaching in the markets, and seemed completely different from the last time I saw him flipping tables. While his words were clear to me at the back of the crowd, he did not shout. He just somehow spoke with enough authority, maybe, that he had no need to raise his voice. He was talking about tenants in charge of a vineyard that had abused the owner's men. It grabbed my attention easily as I fully understood the need to trust your tenants and workers to care for your goods. I couldn't help but stare at those men who'd left my household to be here this morning. Yeah, having trustworthy tenants and workers was important to me. He completed his story by saying that eventually the tenant workers had sought to kill the heir to the vineyard, and that the owner would come to kill the tenants for their intent and give the fruits of the vineyard to another. The crowd seemed shocked that he would end the story that way. I could hear them gasping and saying, surely the owner wouldn't be that vengeful. As the crowd continued in their consternation, you could see on Jesus' face that he found them exasperating. I felt his frustration in that moment. That story made sense to me. I would sure want to eliminate any threat to my livelihood. Across the steps, you could see Jewish elders huddled together in their usual pod, pointing, grimacing, and trying to address the crowd themselves. They didn't seem to be getting much attention, which only served to make them more incensed. Even though I found his story interesting, I still needed to get this crowd dispersed. I made my way up to those useless elders. They saw me approaching and seemed to huddle in together like a flock of frightened sheep. One of the oldest men in the group stepped forward to stop me. He tried to inform me that I was in their territory and that I needed to leave them alone. Despite the frustration it caused me, I told them how we had the same goal, to have this man be done with and to disperse the crowd. I suggested that if they wanted to get rid of him for good, that they would need to catch him slandering the greatness of Rome. If he was the savior they claimed he was, then he wouldn't be willing to bend a knee to the requirements of our government. The elders seemed to light up, and one of them grabbed one of their servants and whispered in his ear. I watched as that servant slipped from the stairs down into the crowd. He waited for a few minutes, then stood and spoke. With sugary sweet words, he spoke to Jesus like one of Jesus' most fervent followers. I could hear the elders snickering behind me. The servant praised Jesus for his truthful and godly teaching, and then he lowered the gauntlet. Is it lawful for us to give tribute to Caesar or not? If Jesus made it out of this question alive, it would be a miracle. I could see it, the crowds turning on him for saying yes, the Roman guards arresting him for saying no. I stood there with the elders just knowing we had him. To my surprise, and before he answered the man, he looked right at the elders and then at me. I didn't want to admit it, but that look felt like he read my entire life in a glance. I felt my breath tighten as our eyes stayed locked. That man was unusual. He broke his gaze from mine and he turned back to the servant. It was obvious he knew our plan. Without further deliberation, he asked the servant to hold out a coin and had the man tell the crowd whose face was on it. As the servant recognized that the coin was Roman, Jesus responded, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's." The servant did not respond and bashfully sat back down among the crowd. The elders next to me turned in on themselves and left me standing there feeling very seen and utterly alone. This man had spoken with authority and wisdom that rivaled the best of our Roman scholars, he would be a much bigger force to be reckoned with than I had initially assumed. Straightening my spine and affecting an air of indifference, I walked away from the temple stairs. He would not get the best of me here in front of these people, and I had other routes I could take to make sure he was done with.
Among my list of duties, I found myself in the area of the temple to meet with a vendor. The massive people that crowded the streets around the shop I needed to enter told me that something was, yet again, happening at the temple. Doing the math, I knew I had to check to see if Jacob was part of this gathering. I could hear one man's voice carrying across the square below the temple stairs. So, making my way forward, I finally saw the face of this man named Jesus for the very first time. It wasn't hard to see why he intrigued Jacob so much. He didn't come across as arrogant or dress or act like a superior, like our elders often did. He looked oddly normal and spoke with authority, but yet without derision. I glanced over the crowd to see if I could find Jacob, but the mass of humanity was just too large to find my brother. Inevitably, my ears caught the story Jesus was telling. You could tell he was trying to convey a greater lesson than some man losing a vineyard. But it didn't seem to connect well with the people in the crowd. They seemed quite surprised by the story. The elders, including my father, and what looked like a Roman statesman, were not happy. And what was a Roman statesman doing there? I could see them conspiring off to the side of the stairs. Father did not need to see me and think I was part of this, so I stepped behind a tall man to my left and to be a little bit less obvious. When Jesus finished his story, he began answering questions from those among the crowd. When he was doing this, I tore my attention away to again look for Jacob. I was so surprised at the diversity of people. Old, young, Jew, Gentile, they were all enraptured. Despite my efforts, I still couldn't find Jacob. Either he wasn't here, or he was at least smart enough not to make himself known, with my father standing there watching. At that moment, a man stood and asked about the burdensome taxes that the Roman government had placed on our people. It made sense, as that man teaching the group had claimed himself a savior. So surely he had something to say about how Rome treated the people he was supposedly sent here to save. I watched Jesus turn to stare at the elders, my father, and the Roman statesman. And as Jesus locked eyes with him, the Roman turned the color of the flour Mother kept in our larder. Something Jesus had conveyed in that stare had rattled him. Maybe Jesus does have some kingly authority to shake off the bonds of Rome. Jesus turned back to the man in the crowd with an answer that was shocking. He still wanted us to pay our taxes to Caesar. I thought the Savior was to come and free us from all that. What did he think he was doing? Surely that would wake up the crowd to his falsehood. But it didn't. They seemed all the more intent upon his words, and the men in the crowd and the elders all just shrank away at his answer. As I looked at these events unfolding in the square, there stood that Roman statesman. For just a second, I saw on his face fear and maybe respect. But he quickly took control and only walked away. The crowd could sense the tide had changed in that moment, and it seemed to draw in closer to Jesus as he stood there on the stairs. Standing there watching, I had lost my vigilance for the possible danger around me. The large man in front of me had moved away with the crowd, and I stood there exposed. And then a hand abruptly grabbed my shoulder, and I jumped in fear. I just thought, oh, I'm going to get hauled off in front of the Roman courts and just for being part of this. And then I turned around and I was relieved that it was Jacob. He had been there listening to the stories of Jesus. As much as I searched the crowds, I'd failed to look up to the rooftops. He had joined a group of followers on top of a nearby shop and saw me standing there on the outskirts of the square. I could tell he was excited by my presence. He thought my being there was a sign that I was ready to follow that man too. Before I could explain the real reason, he began excitedly recalling all he had heard and what he had seen Jesus and his men do. He was giddy at the anger of the elders and father, and seemed to think Jesus' stare down of the men was the highest level of entertainment. Here again, my brother finding delight in causing trouble. He would never change. And as he stood there recalling the last few hours of the temple, I realized that he had left the house with no intent on fulfilling his duties at home. He had left to be there, to hear Jesus speak. My relief at finding him turned into outright anger in less than a minute. I didn't have the ability like Jesus to speak with authority without raising my voice. Standing there in that square, I loudly admonished Jacob for yet again shirking his duties and embarrassing the family. How could he do this to Father? Could he imagine what would have happened to Father if Jacob had been seen there by the elders? Father would become a laughingstock. And what about me? He was putting everything at risk just to follow some guy that he felt he had a connection to. I informed Jacob that he must return home immediately and resume his life as the second son in our father's household. Anything less than that, I would be informing Father and the elders, and he would be subject to discipline. My words turned Jacob's countenance into resentful anger faster than a lightning strike. He began telling me how I didn't get it, about how Jesus was the Savior we were promised, but that it wasn't about who would rule an earthly kingdom. Then, rejoining his new friends from the crowd of followers, he stormed off to return to the roof. Words left on my tongue. I stood there with the eyes of Jesus' followers staring me down. Some looked mad, others had faces of pity. One tried to say something to me, but I turned and I stormed away. Father was going to hear about this. It was time to put this nonsense to rest.
A Holy Week story, When the Human and the Holy Collide, is written and produced by Kelly Duke with editing and oversight by Philip Larson. Vocal talents provided by Brett Bauer, Tony Gregory, Randy Kemp, and Mary C. Bruce. Theme music written by Danny Lee, Andy Dixon, Scott Garnan, and Stephen Gray, and performed by the West Metro Worship Collective. Background instrumentals provided by Higher Power. Discussion and insight questions by Ryan Abernathy. Sound editing by Ron Duke.